Hello, and thank you for joining us today for the Features of Fidelity module. This module is brought to you by the Rhode Island Intensive Math Intervention Project, and my name is Jenna Richard, and I will be guiding you through the module today. Before we begin, I would like to give credit to the National Center on Intensive Intervention, where some of the content from the first few slides of this presentation were taken from. To find the training series and other great information related to instruction and intervention using a multi-tier prevention framework, please visit www.intensiveintervention.org. First off, what is Fidelity? Fidelity refers to how closely prescribed procedures are followed, and in the context of schools, the degree to which teachers implement programs and instruction the way they were intended by the program or practice developers. It also relates to the quality of the implementation. This means that teachers are implementing with consistency and accuracy and adhering to the instructional plan with integrity. Monitoring fidelity is not intended for an evaluation of educators, but instead it is an opportunity for productive feedback amongst educators that are collaborating and learning from one another to improve their instruction. Pierre Angelo and Juliana concluded that positive student outcomes are particularly dependent on aspects of fidelity within the framework of a tiered support system. One of these aspects is fidelity of implementation at the classroom or teacher level. The other aspect is fidelity at the student level. Why is fidelity important at the teacher level? If teachers aren't consistent and accurate in delivering core instruction and secondary interventions, they aren't able to confidently explain a student's lack of response. Did the student make insufficient progress because they require more intensive instruction or intervention? Or did the student make insufficient progress because the instruction and/or intervention wasn't delivered with fidelity? Without practicing consistency and integrity in instructional delivery, we cannot link or attribute the student outcomes to the instruction provided. Fidelity allows us to evaluate the effectiveness of the instruction or intervention and tells us when a student may require a more intensive level of instruction and/or intervention. This graphic provides one example of a way to think about fidelity and includes the elements of adherence, exposure, quality of delivery, program specificity, and student engagement. Schools should have procedures in place to monitor the fidelity of their implementation of instruction and interventions. While these don't have to be formal, it is important to consider whether or not they're implementing programs and practices the way that they are intended to be delivered. In the midst of all the responsibilities of educators, small checks can make a big difference in keeping services for students on track. When we discuss adherence, we are focused on how well we stick to the plan, implementing the curriculum, instruction, assessment, or interventions as it was intended to be implemented based on research. For core instruction and secondary interventions, this may mean how well teachers implement all pieces of an instruction in the way they were intended to be implemented. This doesn't necessarily mean that teachers should follow a script word for word, but that covering certain content with appropriate pacing and relevant language and techniques are important. Exposure, also known as duration, refers to how often a student receives instruction or an intervention and how long the instruction or intervention lasts. When thinking about fidelity, we are considering whether the exposure and duration being used with the student matches the recommendation by the developer of the curriculum, practice, or intervention. For core instruction of mathematics, all students should be receiving a daily uninterrupted block of grade level mathematics instruction. In the case of secondary interventions, developers and researchers typically specify the required exposure or duration that is needed for the intervention to be effective for most students. If the intervention developer calls for the intervention 3 days a week for 45 minutes each day, monitoring fidelity would be asking the question, is the student receiving this dosage? Not only is it important to adhere to the plan, the curriculum, instruction, assessment, or intervention, but it's also important to look at the quality of the delivery. This refers to how well the intervention, instruction, or assessment is delivered. For example, do you use good teaching practices? Quality instructional delivery also means that teachers are engaged in what they're teaching and animated in their delivery, not simply reading from a script. Providing teachers with constructive feedback on their instructional delivery is one way to improve the quality of delivery for secondary interventions. Another component is program specificity, or how well the instruction or intervention is defined, and how different it is from other instruction and interventions. Having clearly defined instruction, interventions, and assessments allows teachers to more easily adhere to the program or practice as defined. Is the instruction or intervention a good match for the student's needs? Is the instruction being differentiated or scaffolded to meet the student's needs? Is the content accessible by all, including culturally and linguistically diverse learners? Is there guidance and specifications around how to best support differentiation, scaffold, and diverse learners in the program or practice? Just as quality of delivery is critical, it is also important to also focus on student engagement, or how engaged and involved the students are in the instruction, intervention, or activity. Following a prescribed program alone is not enough. Consider whether or not competing behaviors make it difficult for students to take part in the instruction or intervention as designed. During the delivery of instruction or secondary interventions, teachers may need to use behavior management strategies to manage student behaviors, including providing choice, adding elements of competition, and offering frequent opportunities to respond. Now that we have reviewed the elements of fidelity, what do they look like in your classroom? And how can you use fidelity to work collaboratively with other colleagues? The elements of fidelity will remain the same regardless of the setting. So whether you're a math general educator teaching the entire class, or a special educator working in a small group reading text to students during a 3-act math lesson, you can have discussions across content, grade, or even school. When you're looking to discuss quality of instruction and specific instructional strategies, it would be best to collaborate with content level colleagues. Whereas if you're discussing student engagement, this may be a fidelity conversation that you're having at your grade level or team meetings. This could also be a discussion school-wide. Oftentimes, schools monitor fidelity by tracking students' attendance. Student engagement is only one of the 5 elements of fidelity and is one source of information about students' engagement to ensure progress. For example, we have all had a student that comes to school every day but is much less engaged than the other students who have missed a few days. So just having fidelity information about students' attendance will not provide us with enough to confidently determine the student's level of engagement. In the following example of a core instructional strategy checklist, I will review the 5 components of fidelity. This tool can be used to support the effective implementation of Number Talks, a core instructional math strategy that promotes mental math computation. This tool can also assist in explaining a student's lack of response to instruction and their mathematical fluency. The first component we're going to look at is student engagement. In this example, we are not only looking at whether the student was present for the activity, but also how engaged were they? How many responses or strategies were they able to come up with? This can help provide further insight for the students who are having difficulty and for those students who are your high flyers that have mastered a concept already and you need to push further. The next component is adherence. How well did the teacher stick to the plan for implementing the number talk? Did they implement the number talks, including all of the key features? Or is there room for improvement and further support from colleagues? This is a great opportunity for educators to have discussions amongst each other. How were you able to facilitate the students? How did you record the students' thinking? And so on. Next, we look at exposure. Where and why is this happening? And are students familiar with this concept? Is this a previously mastered concept for review that students have already learned? Or is it something that's being newly introduced through the number talk? This also assists in the information gathered from the program specificity component of Fidelity. To collect information on exposure, educators might also consider, did the lesson take longer than 10 to 15 minutes that's recommended? Next, for Fidelity, we'll look at quality of delivery. The feedback and self-reflection help educators improve their quality of delivery. Based on quick checks, feedback can be provided in a non-evaluative way to improve the quality of delivery. This is a great opportunity for colleagues to have a non-evaluative conversation with one another around feedback. For example, some teachers might ask each other, how do you get more students to participate in your number talks? I always seem to have the same students raising their hands to share. Another example, Mrs. Jones, I saw during my observation of your number talks that your students explain using multiple representations. How did you facilitate this? And lastly, we're looking at program specificity, which are the sections in purple, and you can see how some of these components overlap. For program specificity, we're looking at having the problem set planned ahead of time. So were the number talk problems planned? Acknowledging the student responses and strategies to now analyze the level of understanding and the difficulty of the task. This will help educators determine the appropriateness and responsiveness to the instruction. Are students coming up with multiple strategies and sharing using multiple representations the way number talks are intended to be facilitated? This tool is available along with implementation resources in support in our Number Talk self-paced module. This is a concrete example of how the planning and formative assessment you use in your classroom every day can support fidelity of implementation, both at the teacher level and also the student level, to help inform instructional needs. Now, on your own, with a small group, with your grade level, with your content teachers, reflect about each of these components and how you incorporate them into your planning and formative assessment. From here, you want to think about how this can be brought to your grade level meetings and shared. How can we work together as grades and teams to improve fidelity of core instruction? Thank you for taking the time to go through the features of Fidelity module. I hope that you all learned something today and you're able to bring it back to your classroom to improve your instructional practices and strategies. There are other learning opportunities available for you in the resource folder with different articles and websites that can provide you more information around fidelity of instruction, fidelity of implementation. Thank you.